When I was in secondary school, I had a brilliant and bizarre chemistry teacher called Mr. Mavromatis, and he got very easily bored in lessons. And once we were all just sitting doing some work in our books, and he wandered over to someone in the class and said to her, "Did you know that if you eat a whole cabbage, you will die?" And she said, "No way, that can't be right. Surely somebody would have warned me about that." And he was insistent, and before long, the whole class was involved in this debate. Everybody was saying, "No, there's no way that can be true. There can't be enough of anything in a cabbage that you would die if you ate a whole." And he's saying, "Honestly, if you eat a whole cabbage, you will die." And then eventually, he smiled and he said, "Look, I never said when you would die. If you eat a whole cabbage, you will die. If you don't eat a whole cabbage, you will die." Everybody dies, kids. And I wonder if the reason that weird moment has stuck in my memory for all these years is actually that we don't often say that out loud. Death is one of the most, maybe the most universal feature of the human experience, but it's also the hardest one for us to come to terms with, whether that's emotionally or intellectually. And so tonight we want to take the time to actually step back and think for the evening about death and about whether there is life beyond it. And this is very personally an important topic for me, because some of the stuff that we're going to look at tonight, the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, is a huge part of what convinced me that this was true and that I should follow Jesus and live my life with him and for him. But to be honest, when that happened, I was a teenager, and the actual idea of life beyond death itself didn't seem that important to me. But as time has gone on, as I've kind of continued on over the last 13 years or so, particularly as I've seen people close to me struggling and suffering, and even people who I love dying, it has become more and more precious to me that if Jesus really rose from the dead, we can have real hope in the face of death. Not just kind of vague optimism that maybe we'll go to a better place, but a real grounded, solid hope that is strong enough for us to lean on when we are weak. A rational, grounded confidence that Jesus can give us life beyond death. So that's what we're going to be exploring tonight. I'm going to hand over to your table hosts as you finish your main, and the servers will come around and start swapping those over for desserts. As we discuss the introductory question, we love to have a chance to hear different perspectives and different opinions. So your table hosts will ask the question, and you can discuss those as you finish your main and swap over onto dessert. So tonight we're thinking about the claim that is and has always been the very center of Christianity, that Jesus is alive. He died, but he rose to life again, and he is alive now forever. Now, if you're joining us for the first time this evening, I realize this is kind of jumping into the deep end, and I'm sorry about that. But in another sense, this is actually a great place to start in thinking about Christianity. Because the first followers of Jesus who wrote the New Testament, they basically say that everything hangs on this. If this isn't true, then you shouldn't listen to anything that Christianity says. But if it is true, it changes absolutely everything. Let me show you a quote from one of the witnesses who saw the resurrected Jesus. The Apostle Paul, in one of his letters, writes, "And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God, for we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead." He says, if this isn't true, then Christianity is useless. Worse than useless, it's a scam. But if it is true, if Jesus really did rise from the dead, then that is the most important truth in the whole history of humanity. Now, obviously, someone coming back from the dead is not an easy thing to believe. But one of the things that I love about the biographies of Jesus is that it turns out that has never been easy to believe. It's not some modern kind of post-science thing, it turns out humans throughout history have known that dead people tend to stay dead. So I want to show you. If you open up these blue books on your table, right at the back, it's on page 62. These are John's biography of Jesus. He was one of Jesus' closest friends, and he tells us that this book is his eyewitness account of Jesus' life. And here he gives us a great account of someone finding it just as hard as we do to believe. So what's happened so far, just to catch you up, was that Jesus was arrested. Most of the disciples fled and ran away to save their own skin. But John and the women, they stayed and watched on as he was brutally executed by the Romans. And the women went with the body as it was laid in a cave tomb on the Friday. Then after the Sabbath on the Saturday, on the Sunday morning, those same women went back to the tomb to anoint the body with spices. And when they got there, they found the tomb open. And when they crawled in, they found the tomb empty. And then not long after that, they saw him. They met Jesus alive. Earlier in this chapter, John tells us about how Mary Magdalene met Jesus and spoke to him and touched him. And then Jesus turned up and showed himself to a larger group of the disciples. But John explains that one of the disciples, Thomas, wasn't there when that big first appearance to the others happened. So let's read what John tells us from the top of page 62. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my fingers where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." I love Thomas because he's so relatable. He finds it hard to believe what the others are telling him just as much as I do, presumably because it just seems too huge to be true, too good to be true. So I just want to think for a minute, firstly about what would this mean if it was true, and then we'll think about, can we actually believe it? So, what would it mean if it was true? Firstly, and most obviously, it would mean that death isn't the end, that Jesus really can give us life beyond death. We saw a couple of weeks ago that Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even though they die." And if this is true, then that would mean that he meant it, that he literally can raise us from the dead, heal this whole world, and give us a glorious resurrection body to live life as it was always meant to be with him forever. Secondly, it would mean that Jesus really can give us peace with God. We thought last week about how Jesus willingly died as an act of sacrificial love so that he could forgive us if we come to him. He died the death that we deserve so that he could deal completely with all of our guilt before God. He could bury it in his own tomb forever. And we see that really beautifully here. You know, Jesus walks in, the all-powerful one, walks into a room full of people who mostly have just a few days ago abandoned him, failed him at his hour of greatest need. And what does he say? He doesn't shout at them. He doesn't say, "I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed." He spreads out his arms. They can see the nail wounds in his hands from where the nails went in. And he says, "Peace be with you." And I think he probably smiled at them. That is what Jesus says to us. If we ask him for forgiveness, he has willingly suffered the pain our guilt creates on the cross. So he just shows us the wounds and he says, "Peace be with you." He gives us a peace with God that literally nothing can take away. No failure or sin of ours, and not even death itself. And finally, do you see what Thomas realized here that this means about Jesus? When he sees Jesus alive, he takes it all in and he says, "My Lord and my God." If Jesus really rose from the dead, it means that Jesus really is who he said he was. He really is God. And that means that he's not just God in the abstract, he is our God, whatever our story, whatever our background. Because Jesus didn't just come and teach people how to be a good person. He wasn't just one amongst many religious leaders. He taught people about himself all the time. He said he had always existed. He said that at one point, if anyone has seen me, they have seen God. He claimed that he personally could forgive people's sins and that he would be the one who would come back and be the judge of every human being who ever lived. Jesus made it completely clear that for every single one of us, the most important thing about us, the most eternally significant thing in our lives is what our relationship is to him. And that's why when Thomas says, "My Lord and my God," he doesn't say, as every other great religious figure would have done, "Don't call me God, don't worship me, worship God. I'm just a messenger." He just receives it. And actually, that's exactly how we should respond to him. We should say, "My Lord and my God." So that's what it would mean if it's true. But the question obviously is, how on earth are we meant to believe that? Isn't this just obviously too good to be true? What reason do we have to think that this isn't just wishful thinking, it's actually a fact? Well, to think about this, I want to forget about this book for a minute, and just for the next 10 minutes, assume that this and anything else in the Bible is not special or holy or anything like that. It's just a historical text like any other historical text that you can weigh and analyze. And what I want to do is share with you the 4 basic facts about this moment in history that all serious historians agree happened, regardless of whether they're Jewish, Christian, atheist, agnostic, whether or not they think the Bible's total rubbish. Just historically, these are the 4 basic facts. And then what we're going to do is think about what could be the explanation for that and which is the most believable explanation. And once we've done that, we'll have a bit of time for Q&A. So as I'm explaining, please do note down anything that comes to your mind that you're not sure about, that you disagree with, that you want to ask about, because you'll be able to send that in a bit. So here are the 4 facts. Fact number 1 is Jesus was crucified, died, and was buried. There is tons of evidence for this. There are even non-Christian historians who talk about Jesus being killed. Secondly, the tomb was then empty. And the fact is, if the tomb hadn't been empty, me and you would have never heard of Christianity. Because the disciples knew where Jesus was buried, the Roman authorities knew where Jesus was buried, the Jewish authorities knew where Jesus was buried. And so when people started saying in Jerusalem, where it all happened, that Jesus was alive and that meant he was the Lord, the King of the universe, all anybody had to do to destroy that was go where they knew the body was and find it. And if anybody had gone to the tomb and found the body, Christianity would have died before it had even got going, and you and I would never have heard of Jesus. But no one found the body because, for whatever reason, it wasn't there. Thirdly, there were witnesses who were convinced that they had met him. And this includes people who followed him before and people who didn't follow him while he was living before he died. So we know that the Roman and the Jewish authorities brutally tried to silence the message of these first disciples who said that Jesus was the king of everything, to the point that they arrested them, they tortured them, but these people would not stop saying that it was true, that they had seen him. History tells us indeed that many of them, perhaps all of them, were either imprisoned or killed for insisting about what they'd seen about Jesus. And of course, tragically, people do die for things that aren't true, but people will never die for something that they know isn't true. And so we know for sure that the witnesses, they at least thought that they really had seen Jesus back from the dead. And fourthly, the Christian movement exploded immediately. We know from the Roman historian Tacitus that the Christianity became a really big group really fast across the Roman Empire. This isn't something that was kind of made up many, many years later. It was big news as soon as it happened, when the people who had seen it were still alive. So the question is, how do you explain those 4 facts? And actually, historians have only come up with a handful of possible explanations, and so we can think about them. One major explanation offered is that Jesus didn't really die. perhaps he just fainted on the cross and then he woke up in the tomb. The problem with this is there's no record of anyone ever surviving a crucifixion. The Romans were extremely good at killing people. And also, interestingly, John actually, by accident, records a detail that turns out to be medical proof of death. So if you want to hear more about that, feel free to ask me in the Q&A. The second theory that's been offered is that perhaps someone moved the body. The problem with this is who? The only realistic option is the disciples, but then if the disciples had moved the body, they would have known they were just perpetrating a hoax. And so when it started to kind of threaten to cost them their lives, they would not have gone through with it. And we have no record of any of the disciples recanting on what they claimed about seeing Jesus back from the dead. The third explanation is that the appearances were just hallucinations. And this is the main argument that all kind of serious atheist historians of this stuff have to rely on, because it's so obvious that the witnesses were sure they had seen him. But firstly, it doesn't explain the empty tomb. And secondly, more importantly, modern science has now shown us that group hallucinations just don't happen. And for almost all of the accounts of people seeing Jesus, they would have to have been group hallucinations. And we know now that that just doesn't medically exist. So the fourth explanation, which is often fallen back on, is that maybe it's just a myth that emerged over time. And the problem with that is that it didn't emerge over time. We have writings from 20, 30 years afterwards, the 50s, 60s AD, where not only does the writer clearly believe that Jesus literally came back from the dead, but he knows that all of his readers in the Christian communities around the Roman Empire, they all know that Jesus literally rose from the dead. There is literally not a scrap of evidence that suggests any version of Christianity that didn't believe in a physical resurrection of Jesus. There's just solid evidence that it was there at the heart of things right from the start. And even more than that, the texts we have just don't make any sense if they were being made up as something to try and convince people later on. You can ask me if you want to know more why that is, or you can just read it for yourself and see. So, if none of those other explanations make sense, there is just one left, which is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And it's an elegant solution because it perfectly explains all of the historical facts. It explains why there was no body in the tomb. It explains why people were convinced that they had met him. And it also solves the mystery of who on earth Jesus was. It makes perfect sense. And I'd argue that actually any of the other explanations requires a massive leap of faith. So I would love to hear your questions. We'll take just kind of 3 minutes around your tables now to discuss what your questions are and to send them in on this Slido. So you can either just go to slido.com/hope, or you can scan that QR code and just send in whatever your objections or questions are. It doesn't have to be a question. It could just be miracles can't happen because science has disproved them. Or it could be, however much evidence you give me, we could never be sure. You could just make a statement, or you can ask a question, whichever you prefer, and then upvote any that you would like to hear me try and respond to, and then we'll get through as many as we can in 3 minutes or so. So go for it.
Thank you very much for your questions. Mike, we have good questions for you. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Okay, so the most voted is possible that the body was moved to facilitate a hoax where someone else claimed to then be Jesus.
Yes, great. Thank you for that. That's a really helpful suggestion. And actually, it's helpful that we've looked at the bit of John's account that we have, because one of the features of all of the witness accounts of Jesus after he's risen from the dead is a focus on the wounds. There's a real focus on the fact, and here with Thomas, Thomas is saying, I need to know that it's him. I need to know that he's got the wounds in his hand and his side from being crucified and being stabbed with a spear. Otherwise, I'm not going to believe you. He maybe had exactly the same theory, but the accounts of the appearances all insist that it was Jesus. He was different. He'd risen from the dead. He was different, but he had the wounds, and they recognized him. And these were people who'd spent 3 years living with him, and then they staked their whole life on it. So I think we can be fairly confident that they knew who they were seeing. And again, you'd have to come back to who is perpetrating this hoax and why, which we might come back to in other questions.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Could the witnesses have just made the whole thing up for attention or to kickstart Christianity?
Great, yes. So that does come back to the same question. If someone made this up, the question is why? And what I find so helpful is the realization that it didn't become advantageous in any way to be a Christian or a Christian leader for the first 300 years after these events happened. So for the first 300 years, and particularly in that first sort of 100 years, all it got you was a very serious likelihood of being arrested, imprisoned, and killed. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense that anyone would have intentionally started this as a lie. If, once people believe something and believe that there's hope after death through it, then yeah, maybe they'd be willing to die for it. But it makes zero sense for them to have sacrificed all of their comfort, all of their previous jobs in most cases, their wealth, their safety and their life, in order to make up something that they knew wasn't true and deceive a bunch of other people. It just doesn't make sense in terms of motivation.
That's great. How do we know the writings from 60 AD weren't just rumors that were put down on paper after having been altered by word of mouth?
It's a great question. So could it have been kind of altered by word of mouth between 33 AD and sort of 50, 60, and then just written down? The reason that we can be confident that that isn't the case is, well, firstly, that many of the people whose writings we have are saying that they are eyewitnesses themselves. So again, they would have to be maliciously lying about it because, Paul, who he's probably our earliest documents because we have his letters. Maybe some of them are from the 40s, early 40s AD, and he says, I am one of the people who saw Jesus back from the dead. So he's not doing it on hearsay, and he actually lists the people who saw Jesus back from the dead as if to say, and you can check it with them, because many of them would have still been alive and in the Christian communities at the time. So yeah, that's true of Paul. It's also true of John, who writes this gospel, and various others. So the other thing is essentially just that there wasn't time for word of mouth to kind of change a story in that kind of way, particularly in a culture like that, which was a deeply oral culture where truth and history was primarily passed on orally, as well as there being beginnings of written history at that point. People, it takes a long time, and sociologists know that it takes a long time for stories to change in transmission. And for that reason, many people have sort of tried to argue that the documents we have must be from 150 AD, 200 AD, but there are loads of really strong historical reasons to be confident that lots of them are not. They're from 40s, 50s, 60s. So yeah, there's always loads more to say about these things, but hopefully that's a helpful start.
Thank you. If Jesus did rise from the dead, what does this mean for when we die?
Great question, yeah. So, primarily, it means that Jesus can be trusted. This is how I do all of my kind of, how do I know anything about the world? I kind of start with, if it's really true that a guy rose from the dead, then I should probably listen to him. He's likely to know more than I am about all sorts of things. And what Jesus said was that he would return and judge every human being who's ever lived. That our ultimate future for all of us is to face him and to be judged justly by him. But he said that he had come to die willingly in our place so that if anybody would come to him and ask him for forgiveness, he will unite us to himself. He will forgive us all of our guilt. And we can be confident even now that when we see him face to face, he will say, welcome. And so if we are trusting him, if we've asked him for forgiveness, what it means is he will give us the kind of resurrection life that he already has. He will give us a physical, resurrected body, which is no longer broken, a mind which is no longer broken, and we will enjoy God's infinite creativity and beauty and goodness in relationship with him forever, in a perfect new world. That is how this world always should have been. And he says that if we refuse him, if we reject him, then we will face him and he will judge us justly. And he warned people that that would not go well for us if we have not come to him for forgiveness. And Jesus, as you read the Gospels, he's really serious in how he warns people about it. He loves people. He wants the best for them. And he says, I am going to literally die. I am going to go through hell for you so that you do not have to. Nobody has to. But he does warn people that rejecting him is really, really serious.
I think we have time just for one more question.
Great.
If other religions claim similar miracles, why should we believe this claim over other claims?
That's a great question. So the first thing to say is that actually, to my knowledge, on the whole, this is quite an unusual miracle claim, even amongst the world of kind of different religions. Particularly because it's a claim about it's kind of a total change of direction, and it's a public total change of direction. So all of Jesus' close kind of followers and disciples would have been hoping he seems to be the Messiah, the Savior that we all need. But what they expected, we know historically and in the text themselves, they expected him to rescue Israel by overthrowing Rome, by liberating them from their political oppression. So then when he is crucified by the Romans, that is a clear failure. He has not done what he was supposed to do. And we know from history that when other would-be messiahs popped up, when they were killed, what would happen is allegiance would transfer maybe to a cousin or a relative or a follower, or their followers would just disband and kind of wait for the next hopeful to come along. What you have with Jesus is this total explosion of something entirely new and unexpected, where people now suddenly are saying that someone has risen from the dead in the middle of history, and that means he isn't just going to liberate Israel in a political sense, but he can liberate the whole of humanity from death itself and from our guilt and our sin. And so the whole of what then happens historically is premised on this miracle. Other miracle claims in other religions are usually more of the character, someone kind of builds a following, or stories are told about somebody in the distant past or whatever it is, and then that kind of grows and collects impressive accounts of miracles. But that's really not how Christianity works. The whole seed of it is people having seen a miracle that they did not expect, that changed their perspective entirely, and insisting that lots of them had seen it, over 40 days on a number of different occasions, that they touched him, they talked to him. It's really not like the claims that we have in other religions. And there's a whole bunch of extra stuff about the sort of how reliable the texts are that I won't have time to get into here. But if you'd like to read about that, there's a book on the bookstall called Can We Trust the Gospels that would dig in more to how could you trust that these are historically valid accounts of what people saw.
Thank you so much for your great questions. And thank you, Mike, for answering. I'll leave you to say a few words to conclude.
Thank you very much. So I just want to say as we close, I imagine that for some of us, we're thinking, okay, it's all very well, but however much evidence you tell me about, I'm with Thomas. If Jesus shows himself to me, fine, I'll believe him. But if not, I can't believe something like this. Seeing is believing. And I just want to say that I think Jesus actually challenges that attitude in the bit that we read. If you open it back up to page 62 again, and you just notice that Jesus didn't say to Thomas, fair enough, good on you, good, rational, scientific thinking, well done for not believing the others and demanding that you see me yourself. No, he shows Thomas that it's really him, but then he says, stop doubting and believe. And afterwards, he says, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. In other words, Jesus is saying, Thomas, you really should have believed the others before now. They had seen me, they were telling you the truth. Why would they have been lying to you? So why did you need to see me yourself before you could accept the truth? He is not saying you should have turned your brain off and just taken a leap of faith. What he is saying is you should have turned your brain on and believed the testimony of witnesses that you had reason to trust. And that is what God is asking us to do with the resurrection of Jesus. John Lennox, who's a professor of maths and philosophy of science at Oxford, he gives a great description of what the Bible means by faith. Faith is not a leap in the dark. It's the exact opposite. It's a commitment based on evidence. And that is what John invites us to do in this book. If you look down at the verses after what we read, verse 30 and 31, John writes, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John is saying, look, I have written this down so that you, whoever you are, wherever you are, you can believe what I'm telling you. I've written down what happened. I've written down what we saw, and so have the others, so that you can actually believe that Jesus is who he says he is. He's the Messiah, the Savior we all need. He's the eternal Son of God, the one and only. And John says, if you believe, you can have life in his name. You can have a relationship with God right now of love and peace. And you can have life that is stronger than death. And his point is, you can believe in Jesus. You can believe because I have told you the truth and you have good reason to trust me. And actually, that is how we know all sorts of things in life. You know, it's how we do science. It has to rely on believing the testimony of others to the research they've done. Can you imagine if someone tried to learn science only believing things they could see with their own eyes? It would take them years to get to the most basic understanding. It's the same with history. And it's also the same with any personal relationship we want to have. In order to know anything useful, we need to be willing to trust the testimony of people who we have reason to trust. And that is what Jesus is inviting us to do here. It's what John is inviting us to do here. So I think there are only really 4 possible options for how any of us might respond. We might believe one of the alternative explanations or something else we've come up with. If that's you, can I just ask, how confident are you about that? Because if that's what's between you and believing in Jesus, you really are betting your life on it. In a sense, more than that. So I'd encourage you not to come to that conclusion lightly, but to make sure you think it through. Another response would be to say, I don't know. I just don't know. And if that's you, I just want to say there are 2 very different kinds of I don't know. You might say, I don't know, so I want to think this through more. I want to investigate. I want to look into it. And that's fantastic. We'd love to help you with that. Or we might say, I don't know, but I'm basically not going to do anything about that. And I just want to suggest that in practice, that is exactly the same as being completely confident that it's not true. Let me encourage you, if you genuinely think you don't know, please be the first kind of I don't know and not the second. Or it may be that for some of us here tonight, we are thinking, actually, I do think that Jesus is alive, and I want to trust him. And if that's you, can I just say, that is the best decision I have ever made. It would be the best decision you could ever make. It would be such a joy to help you as you think through what that would mean and as you start on that journey. So please, if that's you, don't leave without telling somebody that's you, that you want to think about that, you want to decide whether or not you can take that step of starting a relationship with Jesus. I'm sure that your table host would love to talk to you about that. I would love to talk to you about that. Please do grab us. We would love to help you. But for now, I'll send you back to your tables for the next 20 minutes, and then we'll be welcome to stay after that, obviously, to discuss what you make of all this with the people on your tables. So thank you.